So who am I and why am I here? So I just like to introduce myself. Like I said, my name is Christopher Jones. I'm actually from Houston, Texas. I'm an Afro-American. I'm a PhD student athlete. Um, I studied in sociology of education, and specifically my research is on student attitudes and perceptions towards race, racism, racial inclusiveness. I'm not a trustee. However, I am in education, and today is about increasing BAME representation. A lot of what I do is about racial inclusivity within education. Okay. And also, I'm a basketball player. And coach for Durham University. Like Colette said, I'm the first student co-chair of the BAME staff postgrad network at Durham University. Also, I'm an anti-discrimination activist, so I support any and every group being oppressed or minoritized. I'm a critical race theorist. I don't know if people have been seeing critical race theory lately from Trump and certain MPs. They don't want it within their government, but it's basically just to make sense of, deconstruct, and challenge racial inequality in society. And one of my identities, I'm also a Pan-Africanist. So Pan-Africanism is just about global African unity. And we basically support three principles, which is humanism, egalitarianism, and collectivism. So humanism is people before profit. Egalitarianism is we're all equal, and collectivism is we before me. So my experience, right? So why I'm here. So my experience regarding diversity and inclusion in spaces. So I grew up in a predominantly white schooling background, so I do understand how it feels to be other, to be like one of the only Black people who are Black in the room, right? And I also attended the HBCU, which is a historically Black college. So I went from the minority to being the majority. So I have an understanding of what it means to be in both spaces in certain environments. Also, like I said, I'm a basketball player. I played professionally. I played in Germany, Slovakia. So I've lived in different countries. I played here. So I have a broad range of, I guess, being around different types of cultures, you would say. And also, like I said before, I'm a student here at Durham University. I'm in my third year of my PhD. So hopefully I can finish this year, fingers crossed. And my aim today is just to use knowledge and experience to support formation of inclusive spaces. So today we're going to talk about like stats on trusteeship. So we're going to talk about BAME challenges within that. We're going to talk about diversity and inclusion and BAME critiques of that. We're talking about what is racism. I know a lot of people may have been hearing about different things, especially because of BLM and what's been going on in the world with COVID. But I'm going to break it down how I view racism, what is whiteness, and how to be anti-racist within your board of trustees. Also, talk about recruitment, responsivity, benefits of inclusivity, and political terminology. I know this is a huge one for people about how they need to advertise, how they need to talk to increase BAME representation. And then I'll end it with the fundamental principles. All right, so I'm sure everybody pretty much knows these statistics. This is just the current problem with low representation. So 75% of charities struggle to find the trustees they need. Only 10% of trustee roles are advertised, and only 14% of organizations feel equipped to handle challenges. And only 59% of charities say their boards are representatives of communities they seek to serve. Also, as far as low representation within certain groups, so young people are 0.5% of trustees, and they're 12% of the population, so that's very low. The majority of trustees are over 50, so 2/3. Women as well, 36% of trustees, which we need to definitely increase that. And of course, what we're here today for is people of color are 8% of trustees versus 14% of the wider population, which is a bit problematic, right? But that's why we're here today. So BAME challenges, like I said, you got to be realistic. So here are statistics for County Durham and Northumberland, right? Also, I encourage people to have a pen and paper just to write anything down that they need to write down. And also if they have any questions for after this. But like I said, so County Durham is 98.2% white and Northumberland is 98.4% white, which is a big disparity in different types of races, right? So 58.4% of people who are Black live in London, and 0.7% of Black people and 1.8% of Asian people live in the Northeast, which is obviously very low and it's very different, obviously, compared to North and the Southern regions, right? So we must think about where we're advertising, right? So trustees are 92% white, and like we said, 8% of people of color. So we got to think about where you're advertising. Understand that you have to work harder if you're in the Northeast, if that makes sense. So it's not helpful to compare yourself to someone in the South when there's a higher population of BAME people, right? So you got to make sure that you're being realistic with what you want. So like that goes into what is an aspirational goal versus what is an achievable goal. So obviously everyone's here because they want to increase BAME representation, but like obviously that's like, yes, we need to do this, we need to do that. However, what is achievable? Like you see the statistics, you see the differences. So what is actually an achievable goal for your charity? Like I said, at the end of the day, all goals can be achieved. You just have to work harder, right? Okay. So a little bit more statistics. So getting on board talks about, so there's 168,000 number of registered charities in England and Wales. There's 950,000 number of trusteeships. 2,000 trusteeships are appointed on average every week in England and Wales, and there's 90,000 number of vacancies, right? So representation is not enough. So I'm just going to explain like the difference between diversity versus inclusion and what the difference is. So diversity means there are people with different protected characteristics in the workforce, right? So diversity is more of a numbers game. But inclusion means the people of different protected characteristics are valued and have opinions that contribute to the workforce. So inclusion is more impact, right? So diversity is a numbers game. Inclusion is impact. So companies can mandate diversity, but they have to cultivate inclusion, meaning inclusion has to be like at the forefront, has to be at the source of a board of trustees, right? So you see the statistic. It says 30% is critical mass when minority group voices are actually being heard. The issue with that is, so we want BAME voices to be heard, right? But research suggests that inclusion is achieved when BAME representation is about 30%, like it says there. But in the UK population, like we've mentioned before, the BAME is 14%. So we have to be realistic about providing an inclusive environment, right? But at the end of the day, whether there's one BAME member on your trustee board or not, they should feel included regardless. No different from if there's, let's say, out of 10 board of trustees, only 2 are women. Women should feel included just as much, right? So at the end of the day, regardless of that, we should still make everyone feel included, regardless of the statistics. So BAME critiques of diversity. This is so I'm going to try to explain this the best way I can. So diversity has come so for BAME people, diversity has come overwhelmingly to mean the inclusion of people who look different. So what does that mean? So it's more just about, like I said before, about, why do we want to diversify? Like, are we diversifying just for an image? And that's what is a very, very problematic thing within BAME representation, what BAME people do not like. So let's say if you're an organization, so false image equals the failure of diversity, right? So for instance, posting photos as if your board of trustees is diverse when it is not. So I put, okay, so this is just a term like keeping it 100. So basically like you have to be real with your BAME trustees, right? You have to be open and honest with your representation. Let them know that, hey, we may not have this amount of BAME trustees, but we're doing this and that to make you feel inclusive and trying to increase our BAME representation. So at the end of the day, what people like me or people who are BAME, they just want organizations to be honest about what they plan on doing moving forward with their representation, right? And how they feel. And this is the biggest mistake. I encourage everybody to write this sentence down. I'll try to dive into it. But so basically the biggest mistake is when diversity is about changing perceptions of whiteness rather than changing the whiteness of organizations. So what does that mean? So when we talk about changing perceptions of whiteness, goes back to the false image, right? So basically you're trying to change that we don't look white, we have more diversity, but in reality, the way your board functions is still through whiteness, right? So like I said, I'll leave this here for a second, let everybody write down, but like I said, changing perceptions of whiteness is basically just changing the way, it's just, diversity is more of a surface level than actually like making people feel included, if that makes sense. So yeah, so now what is whiteness? I know everybody talks about whiteness. What actually is it? How do we define it? So for me, so white privilege, I know people may not like hearing about white privilege and Black Lives Matter, but hey, this is what, if you want to be an anti-racist organization, this is what you need to know. I love Steve Carell though, right? So whiteness and white people are two different things, right? So whiteness refers to a system of beliefs, practices, and assumptions that constantly center the interests of white people, especially the white elites. So whiteness is more of like an assault on white power rather than white people, right? And challenging whiteness is not accepting a white perspective to be the best perspective. It is about questioning practices in the way we do things so they don't exclude other racial groups, right? So at the end of the day, whiteness is not about making people feel bad. It's for people to understand the practices in place of work that impacts people. So the normal way we think of things are typically from people who are white. Questioning whiteness is just to keep other racial groups from being excluded and people who are white to understand the advantage they may hold, right? So I thought this may be a quick little fact. I know everybody talks about whiteness, but where does it actually come from? How was it even started, right? So the Virginia and Barbados slave codes was the creation of whiteness and white superiority back in the 1700s. Basically, what the slave codes were to do is to suppress more enslaved blacks. But what people also don't realize is that it was to keep poor whites and enslaved blacks from revolting against white enslavers. So what they did was they made codes and they made, let's say, a slave patrol and made poor whites work on slave patrols to keep suppressing enslaved people. So what they try to do is disunify poor whites and enslaved blacks, right? And that's kind of what the creation of whiteness was. I can go deeper into it, but I guess obviously we don't have time. But and that obviously sounds like today, Trumpism, Brexit, same thing, right? A few hundred years later, it's the exact same thing. It just tries to get working class people, no matter what race you are, to pin each other against each other, right? So people can stay rich, so the rich can stay rich and the poor can stay poor. That's basically what it was functioning for, right? So race plus privilege equals whiteness. I encourage everybody to read Cheryl Harris's work. She touches on whiteness really well. If you want to read that. And also privilege, right? Well, I'm white, I'm poor, I don't have privilege. So Sharon Sullivan is a great scholar I would read up on. Her scholarship is on white priority. If you want to write that down, please write it down. So Sharon Sullivan, white priority. I may not have time to go through it, but yeah, I'll just go through this slide. But basically it's for the difference between white middle class and upper class people compared to white working class, right? So white priority is like a felt sense of coming before someone else. So let's say if I'm poor and I'm white, at least I'm poor and I'm white, I'm not someone who's black, I'm not at the bottom, right? That's kind of what she's trying to change. And what she's trying to mean is that when it comes to privilege, just by having a white racial identity, you have some form of privilege because you may not experience an obstacle. So this quote, an absence of an obstacle rather than a positive advantage. Now, what does that mean? I know you can write it down. Basically what it's saying is that from my black identity, I may experience an obstacle compared to someone who is white who may not experience an obstacle, if that makes sense. So for instance, I put Trump trains. My mom last week, as you know, there's a big election going on right now. She was driving down the highway, and Trump trains are basically like a row full of cars that drive, and I guess they're supporting Trump. Obviously, they're wearing MAGA hats, they're having flags, they're driving by. My mom's driving by on the highway, and a man drives by her, starts screaming at her, flicking her off, continues to go behind her, flashes lights, right? And the whole point of the story is what I'm trying to say is that if she wasn't black, would that have happened, right? Would that have happened if she was white? It doesn't matter if she's what, you know what I'm saying? It doesn't matter if she's rich, poor, it doesn't make a difference. At the end of the day, she experienced an obstacle by virtue of being black. And I guess that's what Sharon Sullivan tries to dive down into and tries to explain, right? So I encourage everybody to read up on that. It's a good way to understand certain things. And it's important for trustees to understand that as well, because then you have a better understanding of what's going on and how, I guess, what's going on with, if you want to increase BAME representation, you have to understand what's going on in the outside world for people who are BAME. Similar to COVID and how people who are Chinese are experiencing different types of discrimination here in the Northeast while COVID was happening, right? So to be inclusive, we need to be anti-racist, right? So we explain what whiteness is. Now, what is racism? How do we define racism? So in my opinion, I look a lot into Ibram X. Kennedy's scholarship on how to be anti-racist. So basically, racism is a powerful collection of racist policies and racist ideas that produce and normalizes racial inequities. What does this mean? So I've underlined racist policies and racist ideas. So racist policies produces or sustains racial inequity between racial groups, right? So what is it in your board of trustee group? What is it in your policies that create racial inequalities? Why is it that you don't have BAME representation, right? Looking to see what that is. No different from having less women on board, right? You have to look at your policies to see what exactly you're doing, and what is it that is in your policies that is keeping people from increasing BAME representation. So a racist idea is any idea that suggests one racial group is inferior or superior to another racial group in any way. Now, I understand people may think, well, I don't feel like I'm superior or inferior to somebody else. But in reality, inferior or superiority basically means, I would say, like your prejudices and biases. So you may not realize that you have these type of prejudices and biases that impact how you view different races, right? So a racist is someone who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inaction or expressing a racist idea. So notice I've underlined action or inaction, right? So either you are racist or you're anti-racist, right? There's no in between. This is new neoliberalism. You're either being anti-racist or you're not, or you're being racist. So everyone on this call, I'm assuming, is trying to be anti-racist because they're trying to understand how to increase their BAME representation the right way, right? So, like I said, so anti-racism is what? An anti-racist is one who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or inaction, or through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. So it's basically just the opposite of being racist, the opposite of racism, right? You're supporting anti-racist policies. And what can anti-racist policy be? My opinion, people may not agree, but I feel like positive discrimination does help combat with racial inequality, if that makes sense, right? I know there's a Race Relations Act, but there's different ways you can go around that. Let's say, for instance, if you're trying to hire someone, a new trustee, you can ask for specific expertise within that trustee role, if that makes sense, right? So there's different ways around positive discrimination. Like I said, this is all from How to Be an Anti-Racist from Ibram X. Kendi. I encourage everybody to read his book, because it's like the Bible of like anti-racism. And to sum it up, I know many people may think or may read on things that say racism is prejudice plus power. However, if we understand what prejudice is just an attitude, right? It's just your attitude. And you can't just have an attitude and power and create racism. What people forget is it's discrimination. So discrimination is how you act on your prejudices, right? So I put discrimination there because that helps me remember, like, okay, discrimination is acting, right? So we act on our prejudices, and if we have to have power, and that is what racism is. I thought I'd share this. One of my colleagues showed me this a few weeks ago. This is, I don't know if anybody knows the history of time, but there's been people doing this for, I guess, a few centuries now. I guess there's been anti-slavery movements within Newcastle. Like I said, this is a picture of anti-slavery meeting in Newcastle on May 15th, 1828, right? Also, so this was in the article. I can just read it. So, whilst the wealth of British cities such as Liverpool and Bristol was built on the profits of the slave trade, as we have seen with statues being torn down, the people of Tyneside offered support and a safe haven to those who abhorred slavery in the United States of America. So much solidarity was with the Black cause, right? So like I said, this has been going on for a while now, and everyone here is just contributing to that, right? Now, action. So successful anti-racist governance. So I can sum up a little bit what I've said. So strong leadership on social justice and race equality, clear policies that address racism, right? Zero tolerance approach required by the Equality Act of 2010. Zero tolerance, just like with racism, just like with anything else, was with sexism, xenophobia, anything, right? So to be successful, you can involve students, parents, and communities of color, right? So let's say, like I said, I'm part of the BAME Network. I met Colette from I forgot what we were doing. It was just talking about racial inclusivity within the university. It was just an event or just a meeting going on, and that's how we met. So it's like you can meet different people in different spaces, right? And the university brings a lot of different BAME representation. So if you want to increase BAME representation, especially with young people, go to different student organizations within universities, right? There's so many different, there's BAME networks, there's African Caribbean societies, there's people of color societies that you can go to. That's into communities of color, right? So also ethnic monitoring as a key part of institutional review. I will leave this here. I don't know if everybody's seen this before, but what it basically is just like anti-racist resource. And we can use this individually to see what zones we are in and what we need to improve. So I'll leave this here for like a second. Maybe you can see what zone you're in right now. I would hope everybody's on the growth zone, but I mean, you could be anywhere. We're here to like learn, right? But yeah, so this is right. This, so you can just screenshot. This is online. I'll say some people may have seen it, but yes. Go to the next one. So thoughtful recruitment. How do we make practices and policies for people who are typically marginalized in the workplace to find their own place at the table and be able to say when they get there, right? So we tend to recruit in our own image, right? If 92% of, I think, was it 92% of trustees are white, why is that, right? We have to ask ourselves, why diversify? How do we advance our goals? Why is it so important to have a representative team? Organizations are looking for boards that reflect diversity. So BAME representation would be very helpful. So what does our organization look like? So for example, if you have 8 out of 9 people who are white, how do you increase that? How do you get more BAME representation? Like I said, everything that I've said, you just try to follow all the principles that I've mentioned, right? You have to ask yourself, why are we that way? Are we recruiting people in our own image? Like I said before, is there different habits that we have? You have to try to tackle your biases and try to challenge exactly what is it that why are we imaged the way we're, why are we where we're at? Why out of 8 out of 9 people, 8 of us are white? So interviews, so this could help. So interviews, unconscious bias. So right, we have to be aware. You have to be aware of your own prejudices to avoid discriminating against BAME candidates. So you have to understand the interview panel could impact BAME anxiety. So what do I mean by that? So let's say negative racial experiences. So for BAME people that have negative racial experiences, with white people, it could be really triggering then entering a room and seeing a panel full of white people, right? Especially in a situation you want to prove yourself. So it's important to try and reduce the negative impact on candidates so they can perform their best. And I like to try to compare like race with other different types of protected characteristics. So let's just say, I know I've been here for a few years now, so I understand there's a northern and southern divide, right? So let's say if you're a northerner, you experience some type of abuse, like accent abuse, right, from a Londoner. And let's say you're moving down to London and you're in a panel full of Londoners, and you see that, and you may have anxiety because as soon as you may talk, they may have some type of prejudice towards you, have some type of bias towards you, right? It's similar. It's the similar things of that, right? It's just similar to understand those types of things that could happen within the interview process. So understanding your prejudices and biases. Also, do you use unconscious bias training within your charity? Is that something that you do, right? I was going to show a video, but I don't know if I have time. But maybe I can still show it. No, it's okay. We'll keep going. Maybe we'll show it afterwards. Okay. So now, in the workplace, racial microaggressions. I know people may have heard this term. I don't really like the term, but I'll explain why. So what are racial microaggressions? They're subtle insults directed toward people of color, often automatically or unconsciously. So it goes back to our biases and prejudices and not understanding how people can be impacted. So I prefer what Ibram Kendi says, I prefer racial abuse, right? Because what is the effects of abuse? Distress, anger, worry, depression, anxiety, pain and fatigue, and suicide. So there's really nothing micro about it. And it's not an aggression. So in reality, it is racial abuse. So I put quotations on racial microaggressions because I feel like it's really just racial abuse in a way. So like I said, the less aware we are of our prejudices, the more likely it is that we could be using racial microaggressions. So examples could be like I said, with interview considerations and comments that we make, right? Like touching hair, for example. I know my hair, I love my locks, I love them. But as a grown man, I'd rather another grown person not touch my locks unless I actually know them. That I actually do experience that a lot, actually. Also pointing out a difference. So this is like a few pictures of some Harvard students who are Black, talk about their experiences within school. So like, I've never seen Black people do that. You aren't Black on the inside. Like I said, these types of things add up and they can really impact somebody within the workplace. So why is that important for trusteeships and trustee to understand that in a room full of board of trustees, these are things that need to be understood once you increase your BAME representation, right? So why is it important to create an inclusive working environment? I hope people have seen The Sixth Sense, so if they haven't, they may not understand, may not get it, but right. So yes, interracial anxiety. So findings suggest people who are white experience higher levels of anxiety when interacting with a Black person than their own race. Interracial partnering also, in a university lab class, showed that whites showed less nonverbal friendliness towards Blacks, so less eye contact, less anxiety, right? So we notice race at an early age. What I mean by that is, if we go back to statistics, if 98% of people here are white, right, and you've lived here a majority of your life, you may not even have encountered that many BAME people, right? I actually have a story. My partner, one of her colleagues, talked about her daughter, who was, I think she was 4 years old at the time, saw the first time she saw someone who was Black at an airport. And she walked up to him and said, "I know what you look like." And then her mom was like, "Oh no, like, what's she gonna say?" And then he just looked at her and she said, "You look like a chocolate cake, like a big chocolate cake." And she smiled and ran off, right? So like I said, we notice race at an early age, but at the end of the day, these anxieties and these biases come within time. So it's embedded in us. So because we've all been miseducated. So at the end of the day, we have to understand that these biases that we have been miseducated on what race, on what people are brown or Black, what we and white, what we are, and what we entail, right? So responsivity and experiences in the workplace. So you have to consider how BAME people are feeling once they are on board, right? So the types of events that are put on is Black History Month a focal point. I know this past month we have Black History Month in October, but also you can have Black History Month in February as well, because that's where it is in America. Also, accessibility of events are limited. And also the people creating the events may not be considering BAME preferences. So for instance, like panels, you have panels full of, you have an event on, let's say, sexuality, or like I say, sexism, and the whole panel is white. What does that mean for people like me who join that event? Our voices are not being heard, right? So it's good to have a diverse range of people and understand what BAME people are feeling. Also, like I said, racial microaggressions, hair expectations, and hairstyle. Typically, people who have locks are looked at a certain way. Like I said, say for instance, my nephew has locks like mine, and one of his teachers told one of his friends who had the same hair as mine. The next day he had cut his hair. She said, "Oh wow, now you look like a student." So what does that mean, right? So when my nephew has to walk around with his hair with dreadlocks, and he has to tell his mother, my sister, that how does my sister feel? How does he have to feel? How does he feel when his Blackness is not embraced, right? And his Blackness is looked at as inferior, right? So we have to understand that we have to understand exactly different people's identities. So this is a term called space invaders, so feeling out of place. So once you're in your board of trustees, you don't want your BAME representative to feel out of place and feel like I said, space invader. So what happens with a lot of people who are BAME, we tend to fear rocking the boat. So we hide our identity. So for instance, I wear dashikis. I don't know if dashikis is like African print, like nice tops, African print tops. And let's say if I'm wearing it and someone like points it out in a negative way, I don't want to stick out like a sore thumb, so I won't wear it no more. So I'm just hiding my identity because I want to make everybody else feel good, right? But I'm suppressing my own identity. So at the end of the day, you have to let people of color be themselves. Also, workload. Do not have the person of color be the designated person for race in the workplace. You have to adapt the way we work to support others. Also, benefits of racial inclusivity. So you learn from embracing what we do not know, reducing the scope of deficits in thinking, like I mentioned earlier. So deficits in thinking is like gaps in the way we think, or missing important issues because we are not aware of the issues. And this is a big thing within organizations. When you have diversity, it disrupts habits. So habits of the board are not revealed unless they are challenged, right? So habits save trouble, diversity creates trouble. What does that mean? So like I said, when you're in your habit, You're just going through the motions. It's the same old every day, right? And there's nobody challenging you on what you're doing. And once you have diversity work, like I said, that creates trouble because you're having different perspective, different voices that are challenging your habits and what you're used to, right? So diversity work is a good thing, but at the same time, it can be challenging because of, like I said, it can create trouble. Now, this is a big thing right here. So politically correct terminology. How do we speak to people with BAME, right? So we have to be sensitive in the language and terminology used. So you have to ask your trustee, what do they want to be identified as, right? What makes them comfortable? So BME, that's kind of old, I'd say. People still use it, but obviously there's BAME, what we're talking about today. So Black, Asian, and minority ethnic. Not all BAME, you have to realize that not all BAME people like to be called BAME. So what I personally don't mind it. The only issue is when you lump everybody together and don't break it down. So if you're going to use the term BAME, you must break it down, right? So for instance, I had to critique Durham University's wider student experience strategy, and one of their target goals, was to increase BAME representation. However, at first, they didn't include who do you want to increase, right? So if you don't know the statistics in Durham, Chinese students are the majority of BAME students, right? And most of them are international. So it's like, if you're saying you want to increase BAME representation by 2023, what does that look like? Which, is it Black? Is it Asian? Is it everybody? Does that make sense? So the reason why people who are BAME don't like it is because it lumps everybody together. But in reality, I'm the belief of you can use it, but if you're going to use it, if you need to break it down, make sure you just break it down. People of color, that's a good term. I feel like that's probably the majority term that people are okay with. Non-white, never say unless you use quotes. So never use the word non-white ever, ever, right? Because it just makes people like me feel othered. I've heard this term recently called global majority. I understand it, but I feel like if we're in Britain, it's kind of difficult to have that type of identity. It's mainly, in my opinion, for people of color to understand that they're the dominant group, right? So we talked about what whiteness is, and whiteness is usually the norm. And if you grow up seeing that, you may not understand that, hey, you're actually the majority globally, you know? So it's more for us to understand that we are the majority, right? But here, obviously, we're not. So it just depends on certain contexts, right? So majority minority. So that is for people who are white. It goes back to what I said about people rejecting. This is for people who reject white as the norm, whiteness being the norm. So the majority of how we view things is through a white perspective, right? But in reality, people who are white are the minority, right? Globally, technically. So people may not like it, but that's kind of what that means, right? Okay, so for me, I don't know if everybody's heard how I've been speaking, but I usually like to say people who are Black, people who are white, people who are this, because it's more of I've learned that. So with my part, I've learned that it's more of a psychological inversion if we just say Black people and white people, right? So what I mean by that is a psychological inversion is a self-sabotage. So for instance, if I say I used to say oh, well, it's because I'm Black, I experience this. It's because I'm Black, this person experiences this. So my partner was like, well, no, it's not because you're Black, it's because that person's right? Right, or something like that, right? But in reality, it's so what psychological inversion does, like I said, self-sabotage. So what does that mean? It basically means I would say you place blame on the victim, right? So we blame the victim, the victimized race, for their own victimization. Does that make sense? So at the end of the day, you need to blame the perpetrator, right? No difference between, let's say, if you're a woman, if you experience some type of oppression or subjugation, you may tend to say, oh, well, it's because I'm a woman. It's because I'm a woman this happened. It's because I'm a woman. Well, technically, no, if you flip the script, it's because that person is miseducated. That person could be sexist. That person could be this, right? So all it really does is kind of flips the script and gets you to understand that puts the attention more on the perpetrator than the actual victim, right? So that's why I identify people with, I say people who are Black, people who are white, because being Black is just one part of me, right? Okay, like I said, at the end of the day, there's a lot of different terms. Just try your best to hear the voices of people who are BAME, but I'm not sensitive about it. I just go by consistency. So I feel like once you're told something, then it's how you act consistently after that, right? So let's see. So the eyes only see what the mind is prepared to see. Why is this important for BAME trustees, right? Or trying to increase BAME trustee. So I'll say bringing in a range of voices is helpful because we can become stuck in our ways, like I said before. So the best way is to have an outsider perspective. So we have to challenge and diversity are at the heart of good governance. Therefore, you need different perspectives by having a diverse and inclusive workforce. There is less scope to make insensitive decisions. The more aware we are of our privileges, the more aware we will be of other difficulties which can help us to make changes. So for instance, accessibility, right? If I'm creating a building, I might overlook the accessibility of the building, but if I have someone on the board that is disabled, it's very unlikely they would overlook the function of it, right? Also, pregnant women. If it's a predominantly male board, what are your policies to protect women who are pregnant? What do you have in place to support them, right? Also, if you're gonna talk about people who are BAME, so for Black women who are Black are 5 times more likely to die giving birth, right? So if you have a trustee that is Black, that may be something to look into. Maybe you must also, it's good to know these things to help support them. Also, for BAME trustees, like may experience different forms of racism, right? So like I said, you have to understand certain things. I put coffee machine because I guess I can share one of my experiences when I was in my first year of my PhD. I was probably in my second week and I was at the coffee machine, and there's in our break room in sociology department, there used to be a seminar room next door for undergraduates and postgraduates, right? And I was, like I said, it's my second year. I'm the only Black researcher. There's no Black professors. We now have one Black professor, but before that, there was nobody else. I was the only Black person in the entire department, right? And a young lady who was white came up to me while I was on the coffee machine getting my tea, and she just said, this is for PGRs and staff, right? So I was like, yeah, I know. And she was like, okay, and she walked away. So in her mind, she thinks she's doing me a favor, but in reality, she's undermining who I am, right? At the same time, like maybe because I look young, so maybe it could be, I try to look at it, maybe it's a good thing, right? But at the same time, I have to experience that, then I have to go back to my desk with nobody really understanding what's going on. And like I said, the eyes only see what the mind is prepared to see. So for her to question me, like I said, if I wasn't Black, would she have questioned that? Right? What does a researcher look like, right? So what does a trustee look like? If a trustee is 92%, how can we change that? How can we change how we view that, right? So, and also transgender women of color, life expectancy is 35. So if you have someone on board that is transgender, understand that there's different experiences that they have to worry about and go through, right? So understanding a broad range of perspectives. So last slides. So fundamental principles, right? Recruit for the right reasons. You want to diversify your board because you want diverse perspectives, not just because you want to look diverse. Don't recruit on diversity alone. Like I said, recruit from a broad perspective, finding people with relative youth and experience to bring your board. Also, can you remove all barriers, right? Do they really need a degree? Do they really need previous experience of being a trustee? Do they really need to be able to make meetings in the working days? Also, get your ad right. Like I mentioned before about race terminology, right? Race terminology and false images discussed. So like I said, at the end of the day, you have to be real and honest with what you're doing and how you want to increase your BAME representation. Also, don't recruit for fit, seeking new perspectives. Also, induction week, let's say induction for that discusses BAME resources for your BAME trustees as well. Also, inclusion. So how are you going to make sure your BAME trustees' voice is heard just as much as other people around the table? So like I said before, ask for help when you need it. There's different BAME networks out there, student and staff networks. Last slide. So at the end of the day, to create a safe space, people who are white need to understand their privilege and locate challenging biases. And also people of color need to be open and non-judgmental in discussing race in order to help everyone feel inclusive, right? So women who are white need to question and challenge whiteness just like they do patriarchy. We need to do. Also, men who are Black and white need to support feminism, also Black feminism. The majority white group needs to learn, listen, and change their perceptions of racism, like we discussed before, right? So don't be satisfied, make pathways for everyone. At the end of the day, remember, one is not born white or Black, we are all born human. And I'll just leave my Pan-African principles here again. So like I said, humanism, egalitarianism, and collectivism. This is something that charities should all, in my opinion, like cater around. So people before profit, we're all equal, and we before me.